All right. Hello again, class. So this is week three's first lab. And in this lab, we're going to focus on building on the Excel demonstrations we had from week two and start looking at it more from a data exploration and more business application perspective, and less just trying to use tools when instructed and thinking critically about how would we take a set of data and apply some of the uh, things that we've learned in Excel, and even some functions that that might be a little more common if you find yourself utilizing Excel in the business world. So a lot of this will translate well to the assignment for this week. So if you, excuse me, are having any trouble with the assignment, I know there's a few things in here that aren't in the required text even, but I do feel are important tools to put in your toolkit as you go out into the business world. So I want to highlight those and would recommend referring back here, or obviously just reaching out directly, and I can try to get you pointed in the right direction. With that, we've got a data set in here, should look familiar. This was from our lab last week. It's been updated a little bit to kind of demonstrate some potential real world type examples of why we might need to do certain things. So I invite you to follow along with the file that will be posted with this. So the first thing we do when we're faced with a new set of data, we'd want to understand it a little bit. Obviously, sample, superstore, order. So we're looking at order data for a business. And a good thing to check right off the bat is you want to understand kind of what the data is telling us, but you also want to look at data quality. And I can see just from this first glance, I've got a data quality issue. I've got some blank cells in my category over here, which is definitely something I think we wouldn't want if we're going to do a good analysis. If we need to know something grouped up by category, we wouldn't be able to tell you which category these lines are in. So if I'm looking at that, and I'm going to go ahead and fast forward and let you know, I know that the rest of the columns are fine. You'd want to check all those in real life, but for a controlled exercise here, I'm going to know that that's where we have our issue. So just doing a little bit of quick exploration, I might say, well, let me just focus on only my blanks. And I start maybe looking for any sort of patterns. You can kind of quickly glance. Again, this is where some of your detective skills and business understanding of the data would come in handy. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is we got all 2017 here, and that seems pretty consistent as I go down. So that might be something to look at. And if you click on this really quick up here, collapse it back down, sure enough, only 2017 is showing up. So that leads me to believe, let me do the inverse to sense check my hypotheses here. If I took out all the 2017 data and now I check category, there are no more blanks. So what we've done here, and again, this is a fast forward, it might take a lot longer in the the real world to get to this point. But what we've done is kind of isolated. We have an issue with data quality, and it seems to be centered in all 2017 data. So in the business world, how would that happen? Well, maybe prior to 2018, when we started capturing data in 2017, we only captured it at the subcategory level, and it wasn't until the 2018 year that we grouped those up and created categories. So in our source data, those are just blank values, which is no good if we want to then, for the rest of 2018 through present, we want to include the 2017 data, but we don't have a category. So now we have to figure out how we're going to solve some data quality. In the case of blank data, there's, again, this is going to be a very business dependent kind of what you're looking at. But this is a good example of something that I see a lot in the, again, quote unquote, real world. You just kind of have to use context clues. So if I'm looking at my category here, and I've got a subcategory, I know those are related. Both are related to category. What I might do is filter out all my blanks. Excuse me. There we go. Do the opposite. Filter out all my blanks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my category. I'm going to create a new tab, and I'm going to paste all my values there. And I'm going to do the same thing here with my subcategory. I'm going to copy that whole column and paste it there. So basically what I've done is I've taken, for each row, I've taken this cell here and this cell here and kept those on the same line. So I know that for this row, the subcategory was bookcases and the category was furniture. For this row, the subcategory was chairs. The category was furniture, et cetera on down. So we're keeping that data integrity. And what I'm doing, you'll see when we get a little further here, I'm gonna highlight all of that. I don't need every value every time because what I'm looking for is some sort of map or crosswalk or key to where could I say, is there a one-to-one relationship in this data to where I could derive my category from an existing field. So I'm going to take out all my duplicates up here on my data ribbon. I'm going to click that. It's going to ask me if I'm sure, I've got the right data selected. Yes, columns A and B. I want only unique rows, meaning that the value in in column A and the value in column B together make like a unique value combined. So any unique value combination of those two columns is a unique value. So if we'll go ahead and click that and you'll see furniture appears twice. Well, that's because furniture is not unique just to column A, but furniture in the combination with bookcases is unique because column B is different than column B down here where it's furniture and chairs. So basically we just wanted a unique combination. So we're off to a good start. A quick glance shows us that I don't see duplicates over here. So for every subcategory, I can say that I have one and only one category that subcategory falls into. So if we think back to our missing data from 2017, if I can look at the subcategory column and then refer back to this, I know if I have bookcases in my subcategory, then I can go ahead and put furniture in my category, even though it wasn't populated there already. I know that that's where we put bookcases starting in 2018. Same thing down here, all the way down the table. Now, I probably should have done this from the start, but again, kind of, a more real world hands-on. I was just doing that. What I'm going to do next is look up the values. And to do that, Excel's going to kind of read it left to right. So what I'm going to do just to skip ahead there is I'm going to go ahead and prep my table here and have my subcategory be on the left and my category on the right. You'll see in just a second why we're going to do that. So just to recap so far, we identified some missing data. We kind of isolated why that was happening. Oh, from my business knowledge, that's right, 2017. We didn't capture that yet. How are we going to solve that? Let's use some context. We created a unique mapping where we have an existing data point that we can extrapolate and populate the data point that was missing. Again, something that I actually see and encounter quite often. There's a lot of detective work that goes on, kind of that 80% of your time spent on just data cleanup. So now we have to do the actual work of pulling it in though. So I'm going to go back to just my blanks where I need to put in the data. And here we're going to use one of the more common but powerful functions that you might come across doing any sort of analysis in Excel, which is a VLOOKUP. Now, the premise of a VLOOKUP is we're going to ask Excel to look at a value on a particular line or a row, and we're going to take the value that we tell it to look up and give it a table to go find that value on. And we're going to say, go find a match to the value we just asked you to find. When you find that match, then we're going to ask you to then find in that same table an associated value based off of that row number. So it's very hypothetical when you're just talking about it. Let me demonstrate and I'll walk through the individual steps I was just saying as we go, and hopefully that will help kind of ground this. So to start it, we're going to type equals, that starts our function. And if we start typing, we see it guesses we're going to want a VLOOKUP, which is what we want. Now Excel is going to give you the help here, and it's going to tell you the order of things that it's going to ask you for. The first thing is that lookup value. That's what I was telling you. We need to tell Excel, what are we going to look up? What's the value that Excel is going to kind of hold in its memory and say, okay, I need to go find this value. In this case, we know we need to find the subcategory. That's what's going to tell us what category it rolls up to. So after that, we need to put a comma to let it know to go to the next step. From lookup value, now we're on table array. So table array just means, where is Excel going to go look for this? We know that we're going to look for furnishings. Where do we want Excel to go look for the word furnishings? In this case, we've created our table array on sheet 2. So I'm going to click over to sheet 2. And here's my table. So I want to look for furnishings in this table. And because it's a short table, I can already see it. But a table array means I want to pick any of the data that could come up here. So even though this line is furnishings, if another line is copiers, I needed to find copiers. If my table was thousands of rows long, which is often the case, I need to pick all of them. So make sure you highlight your full table, and that is your full table array. Basically everywhere you want Excel to be looking. Now, we're only looking in your leftmost column. That's an important thing. If I had more columns out here and I only started in category, then I'd want to start at category. Just to say that another way, whatever your leftmost column you're including in your table array is where Excel is going to look for the value you're looking at. So in this case, we only have 2, that's fine. Now we're going to pick that whole table, and you would want to pay close attention down here. This is telling you how many rows, 18 rows, and how many columns you have selected. 2, we only have 2. If we go further out here, let's say we had all of these included. I know that my last column selected, that is column 11. That's going to become important in a second. So we have 2. All right, good. I've got my table array. It's B1 through C18. Now I'm going to click F4, which is going to lock those cells in, because as I copy this formula down, that table doesn't change. The location of that table doesn't change. If you don't lock it in, it's going to move along with the formula. If you move down a cell, it's going to move down a cell in your table array unless you lock it with those dollar signs. Okay, so we're going to hit a comma again. Now we've got our table array locked in. So again, we've told Excel, here's what we're looking for, lookup value. Here's where I want you to go look for it. Table array, making sure that our leftmost column selected is where that lookup value should be found. Now we have a column index number. What that is telling Excel which column you'll find the value that we're targeting. So we know we're going to find furnishings, but I don't want furnishings to be my return value. I want what's over here. Well, in that case, if you remember, I said pay attention to how many columns. We know that this is column 1. If I typed a 1 in here, it would say, okay, well, furnishings is the first column, and it would populate furnishings. That's not useful. That's not what we're after. In this case, it's our second column. We look up furnishings. We want to find furniture. So we say our second column. Now, let's say there was another column here, and our category was actually our third column. In that case, you would just type 3 and say furnishings, skip column 2 because it doesn't tell me to look there. My target is column 3. So if you have a table with multiple columns, you don't have to, manipulate it and put the columns in a specific order. Just make sure whatever item you're looking up is on your far left of your selection. So we'll go back to 2 because we know it's in our second column. And then the last, you'll hit another comma, and it's going to ask you true or false. True, approximate match. False, exact match. In my career, I don't know that I've used true maybe 2 or 3 times. An approximate match is kind of like a fuzzy match. It's going to look for a value in the, maybe if you're in a range of numbers, let's say, so we're looking up a numeric value and it's like, oh, anything from 0 to 1, something like that. But basically it's going to find the first value that's similar enough, and it's going to return that. In most cases, in this case especially, we want to make sure it's an exact match. If we had like furnishings and furniture in this subcategory column, and we put a approximate match, it might stop at furnishings, even though it was furniture, and say, that's fine. So in this case, we're going to say false. Now you can either type out false, click it, or just creature of habit. I've been doing this like long enough. It used to just be a 0. 0 always equals false. 1 always equals true. So now we've got our completed formula. One more time, tell it to VLOOKUP, which cell you want it to look up, where you want it to look, your table array, which column in your table array the target value is going to be found, and then true or false for an approximate or an exact match. So if I hit enter now, we're going to see, like magic, we've gone from looking at furnishings on this row, and we've pulled in furniture here. If I copy that down just one time, office supplies populates, because that same formula, which is why we locked these here, when you copy formulas in, it's going to automatically change the row. So even though it was 07 up here, it knows we moved down 1 row. It's going to change 7 to 8, and it's going to lock this table in because the table location doesn't move. So this same formula that we copied down is now looking in 08 for our 8th line, and it's looking up art. So it's telling it to say, look up where you find art on sheet 2. If I find art on sheet 2, I go over to our second column and pick that value. It says office supplies, and sure enough, that's what it returned here. So the benefit of doing it this way is instead of having to go through and look up each one of these and populate it back in, now if I copy this again, click Control down, or you can just copy the formula down. I go back up, highlight all of these fields. As soon as I hit enter, it's going to put that formula in, and like magic, we now have a dynamic correct category based off of our mapping in all of those almost 2,000 rows that we didn't have to go manually find each and every row one at a time. Huge time saver, and we've just solved for a major data quality issue. So pat on the back, we've got step 1 done there, and now we've got a more complete data set. We see there's no more blanks. All right, so that is, again, it's a trick that's used very, very frequently, and that VLOOKUP is powerful in all kinds of instances, not just like a data cleanup or data exploration. Now, there's another tool that's going to be kind of important, and it's also important to understand the idea of what we're doing here, because we're going to translate some of these things into different tools as well, of like at least the principles. And here is the, most obvious, most straightforward way to kind of see behind the scenes what we're doing with that data. And in this case, I kind of call it like a transpose function, but we're going to take one of these columns and we're going to basically create row headers out of it. And then we're going to populate either a 1 or a 0 if that row is true for that header or false for that header. So in this case, let's say segment, okay? There's going to be a reason shortly in this video and on your assignment that we're going to need to know if the row is a specific segment is true or false. So the first thing we would do is we'd want to know how many values we have. So you can quickly click that filter, see that there's 3 rows here: consumer, corporate, home office. Just because I'm lazy, I'm going to do kind of my same trick here. I'm going to copy that, just go over here, paste it real quick and remove my duplicates. All right, so now I've just got the 3 without having to type them out manually. Even better, if I Control X, I cut it instead of copy it. If you right click into the cell here and your paste special, I'm sorry, I told you wrong. Don't Control X. I can never remember it's one or the other. It's Control C, so you want to copy it. Now, if you right click here, your paste special options are open. You can either click this one here or you can find it here, but you see transpose, which is kind of why I call it that. You're starting in that cell. If you hit transpose, oh, I always trick myself. Sorry, let's move them down first. Now you can Control C. It didn't want us to overwrite where we were copying from. Hit transpose, and you see what it does. It takes them from a downward, vertical paste to a horizontal across the top. So that goes quicker when I'm just kind of doing it on the fly and not trying to overthink it and talk about it. Trust me that it could be a time saver if you do it correctly. But the end goal here, no matter how you get there, is we just wanted to take all of our unique values for segment and have them show up once each as a header. Now, the reason we did that is in each cell, we want to put a 1 in the cell for where that row is true, meaning if row 2 is consumer, then we want a 1 here. If it's not, we want a 0. If row 2 is corporate, we want a 1 here, and if not, a 0. And if it's home office, 1, otherwise 0. Now, again, I could look at it and say, okay, consumer 1, 0, 0. Consumer 1, 0, 0. This is going to take forever, but that's what we're going for. So as with anything in Excel, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a quicker way. In this case, we're going to use a logic function. We're going to say if, and we're just going to basically treat it as a true false. And the important thing is here to understand the if logic, but also understand how to why we use these headers as the actual names. And I'll show you why here. So we're going to start again with our equal sign, start our formula. Now I'm going to tell it if. Okay, so Excel, if, what's our logical test? Well, our logical test is we want it to be consumer segment. So I'm going to tell it to look where we get the segment for each row. So for row 2, it's cell K2. I want column K, cell 2. If that equals, now I don't, in this case, you could just type out consumer with, quotes around it. You could do that if you've got a couple, but let's say we've got 15 columns and we want to be able to copy over our formula pretty quickly without having too much trouble there. So I'm going to say if K2 equals, and I'm going to point it to this cell up here. So if K2 equals our header, now again, as with the VLOOKUP, since we're going to copy this formula down, make sure you lock that in. We don't want it to then move down and say, look up the next row, but look at the cell right above it, which is what it would do if you didn't lock that. You might come across that error in your homework, so make sure to remember that. So if our K2 equals our header, hit a comma, now we're on to the next part. So we told it the test. Is this true or false? Let's say it comes back true. Value if true, then give me a 1. And what if that statement is false? Then I want a 0. End our formula there, and we should get a 1 there. Now I'm going to make an error here intentionally, and I'll go through why. So if I did that, I might think that's working fine, and I would copy it over, one more time, paste it into here, and okay, that seems good, right? So let's go down. But now we've hit a problem here because corporate, I can see that line 3 is clearly corporate. So why would that happen? I mean, let's see. I'm telling it, this is good troubleshooting. If this happens, in your assignment or in your work, go and look at the formula. What did you tell Excel to do? It's just going to do what you tell it to, no matter what. So this is a problem. Oh, okay. I've got 2 problems here. My formula is telling it, and luckily they highlight it in color, right? I'm looking at L4. Why the heck would I be looking at L4? I don't want L, I want K, right? Well, that's because we didn't lock anything in on that particular statement. In the case of T1, we locked in both the column and the row with those $signs, but we didn't do either of that here. So when we moved down, it said, okay, move down 2 rows when we copy it, but we also moved over from column T to column U. So it said, okay, then move over from column K to column L. Well, that's not what we wanted. Worse still, oh, we messed up. We're still looking for consumer here. Well, that's because we locked in both our column and both our row. So when we moved over from column T to column U, it moved over here, but it didn't move over there. So you have to be careful when you're locking things in to know whatever the $sign is in front of is going to keep that value and not move along with it anytime you copy the formula across or down. So let's go back and try it again, and let's think about how we would do that. All right, so if K2, well, I definitely want it to go down. I don't always want to be looking at row 2, so I think that part's fine. But what do I want to make sure? Well, I want to make sure if I copy the formula to the right or to the left, I'm still looking at column K. So I'm going to put a $sign in front of just that part. Same thing with T1. Okay, well, I always want to be looking at my header, at my row 1. But if I move to the right, I want to make sure I move to the right on what I'm looking at. So I'm actually going to take out that $sign in front of T1. So now I'm telling it to keep your column here, move your row, and the inverse, keep your row here, but move your column. So let's try it again. Good, we still have a 1, that's what we'd expect. Those are still zeros. So now we can take all 3, copy, let's paste down, drum roll, ta-da. So now we have the one where we should see it. And again, if you click into it, always a good logic check. I'm thinking I want to look from here. I want to match it here. Those are the highlighted cells. Whew, it's working. All right, so now that we feel good it's working, I would say go across and highlight all 3, Control C, copy them. And then again, this is just my habit, but whatever way you can copy them down, I'm gonna highlight all the rows that we want it pasted into, hit enter, and that quickly, now we've got all of those cells populated. Now, once again, a good sense check, okay? I feel like it's working correct. I checked my logic as I went, but it's always good to kind of data quality check yourself as you're going when you're doing data manipulation, data calculations. So here I would say, go to your very bottom and look how many rows you have. We've got 9,995. With one header, that means we've got 9994 rows. That means if there should be between these three only 1 and 2 zeros, we should have 9,994 as our sum if we highlight all three. And sure enough, we've done our work correctly. We've got an exact match. So between looking at the formula and the total matching our expectations, I think we feel good that we've got a successful formula written in those. And we've now used logic to transpose from a text-based consumer, corporate, home office to 3 columns with either a 1 or a 0 to state true or false as to which category it's in. So well done. We've gotten through 2 kind of heavy lifting, but very valuable exercises that I think serve really well. But now we want to start thinking, why are we doing this and how are we going to use it? So for that, we say there's even more functions for this. And we're going to start with a little bit more of the manual way to do it because it's still valuable and still utilized quite a bit. But then we'll look at kind of how that might be done in a different way that's a little more automated in Excel, but not always the right answer for several reasons. So let's say for the first case, I want to summarize this data within Excel, and I just want to create a table, and I want to know a count of my rows, which is, basically how many total items across all orders. I want to know the count by, let's say, region. So I've got my regions here. All right, so I'm going to use my trick again, and this is just old habit, but I'm going to say, give me all my distinct regions, paste that there, remove my duplicates. So now I've got my 4 regions: South, West, Central, East. And I'm going to say my product count. And I'm doing that, again, something that you would just get to know when you're working within this data. I don't call it order count because you see here, like this is all in the same order. And the reason it's different is it's just got different products. So to be accurate, I'm going to call it product count. But for the purpose of this exercise, just understand what the functions are doing and why you might apply them. So I want to count, but I don't obviously want to just count each individual line by hand. As I said, Excel's got a formula to help us. So another logic one, we're going to use an if statement, similar again, but we're going to add something to it to tell it when to count something. So I'm going to use my equal to start my formula. Start typing count, but I don't want to just count because all that's going to do is count how many things I tell it to. I want to have logic to that. So I start typing if, and I see there's a count if function. We're going to stick with that one. And you see it counts the number of cells within a range that meet a given condition. That sounds perfect for what we want. We want to count the cells within the range that are in the South. We want to count the cells that are in that same range that are in West. So let's go with our count if. Luckily, this one's pretty straightforward. It's only asking us for 2 criteria. The first is the range. Where do you want me to look for a value? Now this is different, okay? It can be confusing. That's why it's nice Excel gives you these little pop-ups with the hints. So this is the opposite of the VLOOKUP we did. VLOOKUP, you tell it first what to go find, and then tell it where to find it. A count if, we're going to tell it where to go look, and then we're going to tell it what to find. So just bear that in mind. If that feels kind of like, wait, is that backwards? Yes, they are different in that way. My guess is whatever programmer wrote one was gone by the time they wrote the other. So let's get back to that. Count if, we need to define the range. Well, my range is my data set. So I'm going to want to know by region when to count. So literally find my region column here. Now I could either highlight just, the rows we have, or let's say I wanted to future-proof it a little bit. I want to count all of column J. You see, it's just J through J. There's no numbers like J2, J. So maybe that's what I want to do in case we, append data to the bottom from time to time. Now, maybe we want to hit F4 and lock in column J if we were going to move it to the right or left. But I know for this exercise, that's good enough. We're not going to move left or right with the formula we're writing. So now I'm going to hit my comma. That's going to move us to the next portion of it. So manually click back over here, and it's going to automatically put the sheet name in, no big deal. But so far, range, count if our sample superstore orders column J. Okay, so go look in J on that sheet. And what do I want to look for? That's our criteria over here. I want to look for on this sheet, what's to the left? A2, south. So again, go look in our range and go find what I'm telling you to find. Close our formula. And let's see, it doesn't like that. That's because when I click back over to sheet 3, I clicked out again. It shows up twice here, sheet 3, sheet 3. So there, and it even changes color to let me know I've done it correctly. All right, so range here, criteria here. And now we have a count of how many times south shows up in that data set. Now, since the only thing that's dynamic here is A and 2, if I move it down one cell by copying it, that's going to say down. So 3 would change, but not over. So A is not going to change. So I should be fine just to say copy this and paste it in all of those. And sure enough, we get all of those numbers. Now, you could just highlight and sense check, but I think if you were going to be building this table to share, you're probably going to want to put a total line here. And that's just to, one, sense check, but also for any customers we might have, stakeholders, to help them along. And if those numbers were to change over time, we don't want to just hard code it. So let's use our sum function, highlight the table above it. And we've got 9,994, which if we remember to the earlier step, that's the exact number we would expect and what we're hoping for. So we've now used a count if function to summarize the product count, the number of lines in our data set, by the region without having to do any kind of manipulation. Just Excel's helping us out there. So that's really great. But wait, there's more, of course. Of course, there's more. Let's say we wanted to do something similar, but this time we want to summarize our data. And let's do it by category. Since, you know, we spent all that time cleaning our data, we want to take each category here. And I want to know my profit by category. Now, if we did the same thing we just did, we would just put a 1 every time we found profit that matched our category. That would be terribly inaccurate. Because if we had these 2 lines in the same category, furniture, we know that the total is adding 219 and 41 together. So we should get 261. But if we did the count if function, we'd report our profit as 2, and we would have some very unhappy execs on our hands. So, whoa, did not mean to click that, and that's going to cost me a few seconds. Sorry about that. Let's start the same way. Old habits die hard. I'm going to remove my duplicates. So here's a good error from a common mistake that I will make just in a hurry. You see that we get pound NA in some of these. Well, that's because I left the formula live, which I do ask you to do so we can check the work. If you ever do that and you see that, like, oh, that's because the lookup, like I said, it's changing where it's looking. There's no data there. So what you'd want to do is right click and right click and just paste values instead of the formula. So it just paste whatever's actually in there, not the formula that's populating it. So now we'll remove our duplicates once again. We would expect those 3 to be done. And now for this one, what did I say? Not a count. We want our called a sum of profit by category. All right, so this should start to feel familiar here. So I'm going to skip ahead to, we know we want a sum and we know we want an if. So we know there's going to be a formula. We're going to start there. I start typing sum. It's not the one we used up here. Just say, oh, pick this range. We need to tell it logically to only do it sometimes. So a sum if, there it is. So we start the same way, range criteria, but there's this third one, sum range. So in this case, sometimes I still get ahead of myself and confuse myself, the range is not the range you're trying to add together. We're not going to go pick profit first, even though that's what the number we want is. The range is just like the count, where we want to go find a value. So the range is where would we want to find our furniture? Well, our range for that is just column A on this sheet. So step one done. Criteria. Again, just like our count if above should start to feel familiar. We're going to look in column A, and I want to know that it is in our calculation. It's true. I want it in there when it matches this cell, furniture. Okay, cool. So now I've got a range criteria. So the difference is there's a third variable we need to put in there, which is sum range. So if in the count if, when it found a match, then it just said return basically a 1. It's present, yes, that's a 1. We're going to do the similar logic, except when it returns, yes, it's there. We don't want it to give us a 1. We want it to pull in a number and then add all those numbers together, right? So the sum range is on this sheet, and we should just know, like, okay, well, that's what we're trying to add together, right? Profit, Q. So we can go ahead and highlight that. But what I want to make sure to point out is essentially what this first part is doing, this range criteria, it's just defining like row 2. Is it part of this or not? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, then 41 gets included. Now let me go to row 3. Is it included? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, 41 plus 219. Row 4, based off these first two. Is it in what I'm looking for right now? No. Okay, skip over 671. Row 5. Is it included? Yes. Okay, then add that. So it's just telling it which rows are included for each of the categories. And that's why you want to make sure you're selecting the same range. So let's say I had manually selected rows 2 through 5 here. If I selected rows 6 through 10 on the second part, it's going to be out of whack. It's telling it how many rows into the data set. So you need to make sure you're always starting at the top and going to the bottom for both your range and sum range. You want those to match. That's kind of the lesson I want to make sure to be there. So let me finish that off so we can show it, and then I'll show you what I'm saying that would do it wrong. So let's copy that over. And again, because I did not lock my cells. And again, this is just to give you an example of what would happen if we did something wrong. RR. So let's do QQ. All right, so we should get the same answer here, right? That's good. Now let's say that I had manually selected, I only want to calculate rows 2 through 5. But when I went back to select that, I made a mistake and I did 3 through 6, 228. Well, if we click into this, we see we're still looking that up. Basically, what we see is it's going to go look in cells 2 through 5 here, and it's going to say, yes, I got a match, right? So on row 2, I got a match, pull in row 2, but it's not actually telling it row 2, it's telling it pull in the first row that I've defined. So because I started on Q3, here it's going to say, yes, pull that in. Well, that's fine, it's still furniture. But for the second part, when it says, okay, the next one is, I'm going to look in range A3. We look over here, A3 is furniture. Yes, okay, good, I got a match, pull that in. But remember, it started at Q3. So it's not going to pull that in, it's going to go 1, 2, and it's going to say, yes, the second row should be included. Well, that's not true. The second row, or I'm sorry, the second row, yes, in our profit is actually an office supply. So you don't want to shift your formula up or down by having a range that starts or finishes opposite, or I'm sorry, different than what the lookup range is. You want your ranges to match unless there's some extreme scenario, which I doubt many of us would ever encounter. You wanted to stagger it, but the real lesson here, I'm probably getting a little too deep into it. Please don't let that confuse you. just make sure your ranges match whenever you do this. Otherwise, you'll have a staggered and your lookup will be one off of, or could be several off. Okay. So our formula works. Sorry for that detour. The focus here again is we're going to look up our range. We're going to tell it when to include it, and we're going to pull that number in, and then we're just going to add it all together. We'll again make a total. We can use the same scenario here. Say sum, just to make it pretty. We can format it a little nicer than that. And now our total is 286, 397. Just for a sense check, again, let's go highlight that down here, 286, 397. Cool. I feel good about that. All right, so we've used two different logic functions now to kind of summarize our data, not just clean it, but summarize it, which is still some exploration, right? Like we're trying to understand and think of how to utilize the data. So now let's think about, why did we even go to our earlier step of transposing? Well, maybe there's a reason we want to utilize that, right? So I'm going to say, I want to know, this came from my segment. I want to summarize in a table. I'm again going to say copy, and I will use my transpose to get a table down here. Segment. But this time I want to count by segment. So I'm going to do a product count again. Now we know that we have the countif function up here, which is one option. But again, one is an alternative. Two, because there are certain reasons that you might want to have that transposed data available elsewhere. And three, because it's a concept that we're going to utilize in some other software. And I want everyone to be able to understand what's going on in the background. So this is the actual doing of it. I wanted to do this and give this example this way. So for consumer, this might become a lot easier. I might just say, let's just sum this column that I created already, that is consumer, and great, I have that. And the same thing here, let's just sum corporate. And there we go. And last one, let's just sum. And like, obviously, if you're doing this for a bunch of columns, you could kind of go in there and copy it down and just change your column one at a time or things like that. But this is just to kind of exemplify why having a 1 versus a 0 sometimes is helpful. So you don't have to use the logic if functions. You can just sum it a lot quicker. And that'll come into play again shortly here. So again, we can just total that sum, and we know we should have a 9994. So beautiful. That's why sometimes transposing it, especially with a 1 and a 0 flag, can be beneficial. Taking something text-based and turning it into a number is really what we did there, and making it easier to quantify. So that is a lot thrown at you so far, but again, these are very common, very useful data exploration and summarization kind of things that are going to help set you apart in Excel. It gets past that kind of initial just pulling data in and trying to manually manipulate it. We're doing some pretty advanced stuff. But next is something that's a little more commonly thought of and talked about, but still kind of a difficult concept. Everyone seems to be familiar with the name, but not everyone really necessarily knows how to use it, when to use it, or especially how it works. So a lot of the same ideas as far as summarization can be done by pivot tables. And pivot tables have become, like I said, a very popular, familiar, and like sought after kind of skill set to not only understand how to build, but understand how to digest. So let's go back to our data. How would we even set up a pivot table? Well, first, we're just going to do a pivot table, you're going to want to be on the data you're going to summarize. You're going to pivot, right? We're going to pivot this data. We'll click over to insert, and you see first option right here is a pivot table. And the screen that's going to pop up is going to ask us to select a table or range and where we want to put it. Well, by default, it's selected everything that's kind of like in a table already. We've kind of got this whole table. So that's good. We can go ahead and leave that. And yeah, I want to go ahead and put it on a new table. So now what we've done is we said, hey, Excel, I'm going to build a pivot table, and here's where I want you to go find that data, which brings us here, which is a little more interactive. This is where we start to get to drag and drop. We're not going to have to tell it, if and when and all those things. So this is where some of the power really starts to come in. So let's say we wanted to do a similar exercise to what we did a little more manually earlier, and we want to count how many rows, or in this case, count how many products individually were sold by region. Well, let's find those variables. I know I want region, so I'm going to drop that on my rows. And instead of copying it over and deduplicating and all that, look at that. It just says I'm going to grab every unique row for region. And that's one of the things I want to kind of make sure there's some understanding. The pivot table is essentially kind of like a summary function of your data. So it's going to say, what's the like most granular level that you need to summarize it. Well, if I'm looking only at region, it's just going to say, okay, well, here's your summary of your regions. You have 4 regions. There you go. Let's say from there, I wanted to know for those regions, I'm trying to pick the segments within them. Okay, well, let me drop that in. Okay, so now there's another level of granularity. I only have 4 distinct regions, but I also have 3 distinct segments. And because it's a combination of those, I don't just have 4 plus 3. I don't have 7 lines. I have 3 lines for each region. So I actually have let's see, that's 12 lines plus the summary. Don't worry about the summary, but there's 12 basically individual lines that make up that. So whatever your most granular, let's say I drug in state, you'll see it just starts to get wider and wider. So that's kind of the function of what a pivot table will do, is it will summarize your data at those levels. We're going to keep it simple for the exercise and just say, let's look at one level of granularity at a time and let it summarize that way. So for my regions, I said earlier, we just wanted a count of how many products we sold. But there's not really a count on here, is there, right? I know profits on there, it's dollars. Quantity, I mean, quantity is a value, but it's not, that's going to give us way more than 9,994. So this is where you have to kind of let the pivot table know specifically what you want to do. So in this case, let's say I want my product name to be the field I'm counting. How many times does product name show up? Well, if I just drag product name, by default, it goes to count because it's a text field. It's like I can't summarize that for you other than to just say how many times it shows up. So that's actually how you would get a count by default. So by doing that with some sort of alphanumeric and not an actual number value, you'll get a count by default. So you could kind of drag on most of those. Now, what you want to be careful then is obviously make sure you want to count once of everything, and it will not count if there's a blank. So that's why we had to do some data cleanup. But that's a quick way that you could just drag something on there and say, okay, here's that same summary data that we got earlier up here by region, how many lines, what was the product count. I've got that same data, but that was a lot quicker and easier to just kind of drag that on there. So let's try it again with our other example. Let's create another pivot table. Insert pivot table. Yes, we want all of this data. I'll put it on yet a new worksheet. And that time we said, well, tell me my profit. And I want it by category. Okay. Let me find my category. I'll put that on my rows. Okay. Again, 3 unique values for category. Doesn't have to tell me how many times each of those are on there. And I know I want my profit. So drag that into my values, 286, 397, and it's broken up. That was quick and pretty painless. And again, it's doing the same thing that we did in the longer form way of the sum ifs. So that's why I wanted to make sure that we understood that. But you can see a pivot table is very quick to do this. Now, the danger there is if we added new data below this, let's say we added another 1,000 rows next month, and we didn't change our where to tell our pivot table to look at, it's not going to change these values. It'll say, well, you didn't tell me to find the data in those 1,000 rows. You only told me to go to the bottom. So you have to be careful. That's why I want to make sure that we kind of understand both ways to do this, because there's some value in doing it not just those two, a variety of ways, but these two, understanding these two ways in this course. So let's make one more pivot table though, to show where the idea of pivot becomes even more apparent, not just like, well, why isn't it in the summary table? Why do we call it a pivot table? Let's try one more here. Insert a pivot table. I'm gonna, once again, yes, that data, new sheet. Okay, but this time I want to know by my region, my profit. Okay, that feels familiar. I feel like I've seen that before. But maybe that's not good enough. Maybe I'm in charge of, these regions and I need to make some decisions. Well, that's because I need to know which segment's driving which profit. I'm trying to see the equity there. Well, you notice we have rows and columns. So this would be a great opportunity to kind of pivot the data and say, show me each region, but then show me a column for each segment within that region. So drop that on there. And now this cross section, I've got within central for consumer, here's my profit. Within central for corporate, here's my profit. Within east for consumer, here's my profit. And then at the end, you've got the grand totals. I still know that central overall had this much profit. I still know that consumer overall had this much profit, but I can start to kind of dig into those cross sections and say, oh, okay, well, here, this one category here, home office within South seems to lag behind, significantly. We're not doing a lot of home office profit in the South. Same thing with central and consumer. So, that by slicing it in two ways at once, you're starting to see a different story unfold. Not just let me summarize the data. Well, let me start analyzing it and saying, hey, there's something that maybe we want to look at. So that's why it's kind of, a pivot table's got some of that power built into it, why it's called a pivot table, not just a summary table. You can get into all kinds of levels. You see how many fields you can pull in there. So that's definitely something I encourage you to continue to explore. We won't get too much deeper on it in this course, but pivot tables are excellent kind of data exploration and quick analysis tools. As is Excel, as a whole, you see, there's a lot of tools that I use in my tool belt, a lot of softwares, and they're always coming out with more and trying to make them, more and more advanced. But at the end of the day, I don't think we'll ever get out of Excel because it's just so easy to kind of mine this data at the molecular level and start to look for those things. So very important to understand these things. Lab 2 will kind of focus on doing some of the similar stuff, but looking at it from a Tableau perspective. And after that, we will transition into R, which we will have some of these same principles. So again, make sure you understand this, not just how to do it in Excel, but kind of what it's doing. And we will continue to build on that. And then as always, if any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. I am happy and here to help. Thanks.